pray that this is offered and received with the highest vibrational intentions. Greetings, dear soul. Thank you for joining me once again. And today, you already know, we're going to be talking about two very hot topics: the spiritual ego and its most favorite tool, spiritual bypassing. First of all, that term, spiritual bypassing, was created by a psychologist, John Weldwood, in 1984, so it's been around a while. And essentially he was saying that the spiritual ego, we'll call it, person using their spiritual ego will spiritually bypass, which means avoiding their own uncomfortable emotions, their unresolved trauma, and they do this with spiritual themes or ideas or activities. Now, before we get too far into this, I want to make sure you understand my differentiation between ego and shadow ego. The spiritual ego, by the way, is a part of what I call the shadow ego. So here's a little 1-minute recap on my terminology. So, your ego and your body is sacred, holy, and divine. You couldn't live without either one. Isn't that interesting? The spiritual ego, as I said, is part of the shadow ego. All of our behaviors that are based on two things, craving and aversion, as taught by the Buddha, develop or increase or support the separate identity, which I call the shadow ego. Now, spiritual bypassing is the favorite tool of the shadow ego and also the spiritual ego. So let's look a little closer at spiritual bypassing. It is, by definition, both craving and aversion. So it really strengthens the shadow ego. The person who is feeling some unapproachable pain, suffering, their own suffering, of their own unhealed wounds, and we all have them. We learn about something like, let's say, Buddhism, for example, or even meditation through Buddhism. a person could use meditation for legitimate spiritual growth and development, and they can experience heightened states of awareness and even the actual separation from egoic thoughts in meditation. That can happen, and it does. However, meditation can also be used as spiritual bypassing. So can yoga, so can so many things, of course. One of the common areas that's used for spiritual bypassing is actually this book right here. The ideas in here and the groups that form around them are filled with spiritual egos spiritually bypassing. And at the same time, which makes this so subtle and so difficult, is that people truly are healed by this book and other activities like meditation. So it's a tenuous term. And in fact, the creator, John Weldwood, back in 1984, he was a student of Chögyam Trungpa, a very famous Buddhist meditator who is also famous for being a cokehead and alcoholic. So Trungpa himself was a very advanced spiritual ego, and his crazy wisdom involved complete bypassing of spiritual bypassing, because he brought on everything. He didn't bypass anything. It's interesting, one day Ram Dass sat with him in the morning, walking into his hotel room or something that the night before was a sexcapade and drugcapade. And Ram Dass sat down with him, and Trungpa could tell he was frustrated and told him, "Sit down, look into my eyes." And within 30 seconds, Trungpa disappeared. He wasn't there. He was so far advanced that nothing he was doing had any effect on him spiritually, emotionally, or even physically. However, his cult, we could call it, engaged in massive spiritual bypassing. The whole group of them. They knew that the ego was bad to them, and so they engaged in practices that destroyed the ego, as it were. Trungpa would have all of the people in his room take off their clothing and do interesting things to each other. He himself, under the influence of drugs and alcohol, was a pretty horrific person and probably should have been charged numerous times legally. But we'll set that aside. The only thing you need to know about spiritual bypassing is that it is simply avoidance, and it is also craving. So it makes the shadow ego even stronger. Now, it can be, like I said, helpful if it's temporary. Otherwise, it's just the hamster wheel, or getting in a revolving door and staying in it, where you don't have to deal with your uncomfortable shadow energies. But if it's temporary, we all feel pain, we all feel uncomfortable areas, and thinking that there's something that can help in meditation or whatever can be very useful temporarily. And meditation is not something you can do temporarily. You should be doing it regularly because it helps you develop the perspective that the mind is just doing its thing, but your soul, your true self, is separate from the mind. So now let's talk a little bit more about the spiritual ego. Basically, spiritual ego is people who latch on to some degree of spirituality and elevate themselves. So the phrase holier than thou comes to mind. And again, we should be thinking about this in longer historical terms than these recent terms have been created. People have been using their, let's call them religions, because they are, but in particular the Judeo-Roman Christian, Catholic, and Muslim religions have been used for spiritual egoic purposes for thousands of years. Recently, that has been, those religions have been losing their hold on a lot of people. And what has popped up in their place, especially in the past 20 years or 13 since 2012, is the starseed religion cult or whatever, where people become holier than thou because of their starseed connections. And guess what? We are all connected to everything. So that sort of slashes through the individuality of my starseed family is different from yours and all of that. Even though we may have had many past lives and or future lives in one star system and our own, we will have other future lives and probably had past lives on all of them because your soul is infinite. Okay? Now, this also brings up another area of non-duality, which can be a huge crutch for spiritual ego and spiritual bypassing. So you see, these go together very well, as it were. Basically, spiritual ego, being a subset of the shadow ego, again, is based on division, separation. It strengthens the individual. I am important because I believe in whatever, whatever, whatever. And the people who believe like I believe, we are superior and others are not. So it's hugely feeding the shadow ego, as I call it. And we could just go on and on and on, but that's an ego function. The shadow ego loves differentiation and compartmentalization. That's why there's so many divisions of Christianity. If they were all being actually Christ-like, there would only be one type of Christianity. Oops! Okay. Even for me to point that out is part of my shadow ego. So, sorry, not sorry. The last thing I do want to say, though, when we look at a spiritual ego or someone who's doing spiritual bypassing, we really need to examine their own personal relationships, their closest relationships. How are they with their parents, with their spouse, with their children, or their lovers, or whatever, their closest students? That should be all you need to really know if this person is actually coming from a spiritual place or not. Like my mentor Ram Dass likes to say, if you think you're really on the path to enlightenment, go spend a week with your family. Oh my. So I hope that helps you in understanding that both spiritual bypassing and the spiritual ego can be small steps on the path to actual self-empowerment and freedom from the ego. Don't get stuck in the revolving hamster wheel door, but don't beat yourself up if you were or are. Don't worry about it. Just get into that observer perspective and go, so. Without judgment, without separation. Knowing that we've all been there, we've all done that, and all truly is one. Lak'esh alakin. I am another you, you are another me. We are one God-sciousness. Namaste.